Hi, this is Andrew Reversa with Impact Soundworks, and today I'm going to be unveiling the new Total Articulation Control Technology, or TACT. This is a new system of mapping articulations in a virtual instrument, including legato articulations and release noises, as well as controlling how the articulation dynamics work. You'll see the system debut first in our Ventus series shakuhachi, and you can expect to see it in future libraries, plus in updates to older instruments. Though I'm using the shakuhachi to demonstrate our new system here, a full walkthrough of the shakuhachi instrument will be coming at a later time. With our Total Articulation Control technology, you can set any articulation to trigger by velocity, keyswitch, MIDI CC, key range, and pedal state, either up or down. We have a conflict detection system to make sure that articulations don't have conflicting mapping setups. With TACT, each articulation can be set to have not just one triggering rule, but multiple. For example, velocity and keyswitch at the same time. Or even 3 rules. Articulation volume, sample offset, and dynamic control, either continuous or velocity-based, can also be changed. We also have the incredibly powerful AUTOMAP tool, which allows you to create an entire mapping scheme in just a few clicks. For example, here I'm going to create semitone key switches starting at C0 for 7 different articulations. Lastly, with TACT, it's very easy to save a mapping preset and even share it with other users. Now let's explore some of these features in greater depth. Let's look at each triggering mode one by one. Starting with velocity. Velocity is very straightforward. You simply play in this velocity range and the articulation will trigger. So for example, we have sustain normal set to all velocities right now. Now let's set this to the upper velocity range and the sustain bend up to the lower velocity range. I'll play lightly first. And as I play, the articulations switch seamlessly depending on what velocity I play. Next, we have mapping by key switch. For example, we have the sustain grace-2 articulation mapped to D0. So if I click and hold D0 and play a note, we hear the sustain grace-2 articulation. Now, if we have latching mode on, then the note does not need to be held, and you can see that the color changes to reflect this. Now, if I click the note, or press it on my MIDI controller, we get that articulation without needing to hold D0. Then to unset this, we can just click any empty key switch to return to normal mapping. You can also map articulations using MIDI CCs. For this example, we'll turn off bend up, and we'll try mapping sustain normal, grace 2, and grace 3 using the mod wheel to select which articulations played. I'll change the mapping mode to CC. Here it's set to CC1 from 0 to 34. Now grace 2 and grace 3 will kick in when the mod wheel is a little bit higher. You might find this particularly useful if you have a breath controller or expression pedal. Another way to map is by key range. The instrument goes from C3 to F5, but in this case, let's have normal sustains only go for the first octave. C3 to B3. Then, we'll set bend up in the upper range. Lastly, you can also map based on the sustain pedal position, which can be either down or up. The conflict detection system, like I mentioned earlier, is a great way of making sure that none of your articulations overlap in terms of their mapping setup. Here we have grace 2 and grace 3 occupying different ranges of CC1. But if I make a mistake and set this to 70 to 127, for example, then you'll see that this highlights. And this works for any kind of mapping. It would work with key range. Here we have C3 to B3, but this overlaps with C3 to F5 on grace 2. In the event of an overlap, the topmost articulation will take priority over the lower ones on the list. Of course, it's probably a better idea to just set these to separate ranges. Another very powerful feature of TACT is the ability to add multiple triggering rules to each articulation. By clicking on the Advanced button, you can see all 3 rules. Rules can be enabled or disabled simply by clicking on them. Here's a practical example. Let's say we want normal sustains to sit on a key switch like C0. And we can put both sustain grace 2 and grace 3 on the next key switch, we'll say D0, but select between them based on velocity. So I'll open this up and first set them both to the same key switch. The conflict detection kicks in, but once we set them to a different velocity range, you'll see that the conflict is resolved. If we press C0, we'll get normal sustains. And if we press D0, we'll get sustained grace 2 or grace 3, depending on what velocity I play. You can expand or collapse all of the advanced views at the same time by holding Control and left-clicking. And when you do this, these scroll arrows appear. By clicking on them, you can scroll up and down, either 1 row at a time with a single click, or by holding Shift, you can go 3 rows at a time. You'll notice that release noises can follow the same triggering logic. Here I have 3 release noises triggered based on velocity. If I play lightly, we'll get release stopped, which is very subtle. If I play a little bit harder, we'll get the bend down. And if I play at maximum velocity, we'll hear the emotive release, which is longer and very breathy. Rules can also apply to legato playing. Here, legato is triggering at velocities from 1 to 99. But if I play at higher velocities, we won't hear that transition. Another thing about legato is that it can be turned on or off for individual articulations. So by default, it's on for sustain normal. If we turn it off, then even though the legato articulation is in the right range when I play, it still won't trigger for this articulation. On the other hand, if we trigger grace 2, then we do hear the legato transition starting from these notes, but it will still, in the case of this library, always end on a sustained normal afterwards. Our TACT system also allows you to set the volume for each individual articulation very easily, as well as the sample playback offset. This is best demonstrated using one of these, grace 2 or grace 3. First I'll play a note with no offset, and now with an offset. You can hear that because the sample playback point has changed, we no longer hear the ornament. Generally speaking, it's best to leave this at a low value, but the control is there if you want to use it. Dynamics can also be controlled per articulation using a dynamic crossfade or a velocity switch. In the shakuhachi, we definitely recommend using the crossfade, and you can see when I move the mod wheel, the dynamic slider on the main page will change. So I'll play a note, and we get a nice smooth dynamic transition. Now if I instead switch to velocity, we'll get softer, quieter articulations at low velocities. And then we'll get the full forte at high velocities. Possibly the most powerful feature of TACT, and what we think of as the crown jewel, is the AUTOMAP function. With this, you can create incredibly complex mapping setups just the way you want it with just a few clicks. For example, here's a typical goal. Let's say we want to map the most used articulations to one key switch range, like C1, and then we want to map the less used articulations to another range, starting at C0. I'll select these first 5 articulations by left-clicking. Then in the AUTOMAP menu, semitone key switch will overwrite rule number 1, starting at C1, and click Go. Now, just like that, all these articulations have been mapped exactly perfectly. Just like with the advanced buttons, by holding Control and clicking, I can either select or deselect everything. In this case, I want to deselect. Now I'll move on to the next 4 articulations, which I might use a little bit less frequently. And we'll map these, instead of C1, we'll set them to C0 instead. The trills and repeated note are set down here, and the sustains are up here. You can also clear these AUTOMAP rules by going to Clear Rule and hitting Go. Here's another example. Let's map all the sustains to C1, just a single key switch, but then use velocity to pick which articulation we'll play. And then we'll do the same thing for these other less frequently used articulations, from trills to repeated, but we'll set these to D1 instead. With the first 5 articulations selected, I'll do shared key switch, and we'll set this to C1. Since there's only one rule, these are in conflict. But if we expand them, and we add an additional rule, in this case, velocity split range, rule number 2, we get a nice even velocity split from 1 to 24, 25 to 49, and so on. With this key switch down, I can now switch between these using velocity. Let's close these articulations and then do the same thing for the next 4. Once again, we'll start with a shared key switch on rule number 1, but set these to D1 instead. Now for the second rule, we'll again do a velocity split range. I can basically switch between 2 different groups of articulations by pressing either C1 or D1. A handy feature related to this, instead of velocity split range, I accidentally hit CC split range, which is maybe not what I intended. Under the preset menu, I can hit undo AUTOMAP and it will revert to the previous state. Very useful. Here's one more example. Let's say I want the sustain normal to be my sort of default articulation that plays most of the time. And then when I play at very high velocities, I want to get some kind of ornament, either grace 2, grace 3, or emotive. But I want to select that ornament using a MIDI CC, let's say CC 15. I'll set the max velocity for sustain normal to 120. Then I'll select the 3 ornaments, go to shared velocity range, and set them from 121 to 127. Rule number 1, of course. Again, there's a conflict, but let's open it up and set one more rule. We'll do rule number 2, CC split range, CC 15, and hit go. Now playing at low velocities, we're hearing the sustain normal. If I play at a high velocity, I get an ornament. And then by moving CC 15 on my MIDI controller, I'm selecting between the different ornaments. No matter how complicated your MIDI setup or what kind of DAW you're using, you can very easily and quickly create any kind of mapping scheme you want, and it's much faster than editing each articulation individually. Once you've created the perfect setup that suits you, you can go to the preset menu, save a preset, and then you can load it later or share with other users. I think that our total articulation control technology is the most powerful control system yet for customizing virtual instruments. You can fit our sample libraries to your particular MIDI setup, whether you're using a standard keyboard, an EWI, or some other kind of non-standard controller. You can also customize it to suit your DAW exactly the way you want it. So, tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.